Well, let me give you a very warm welcome indeed to the third of four Social Contract Research Network seminars that we're having this semester in the first half of 2025. And it is my great delight to be able to introduce this seminar speaker. The speaker today is Professor David M. McCourt, Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Davis, and currently working from and speaking to us today from NYU, Abu Dhabi. He's the author of the book, The End of Engagement, America's China and Russia Experts and US Strategy since 1989. And he's currently finishing a follow-on study titled American Hegemony and China's Rise, Knowing the PRC in Washington, Canberra, and London, on which material from which today's seminar is based. The title of David's talk in a moment is going to be Standing Up to Beijing and the Common Good. And at our particular moment in geopolitical history, it would seem to me that this topic is especially acute and pertinent. The United States and China have, as we will all know, of course, recently imposed huge tariffs on each other. In Australia, from where I'm speaking, recent political decisions reflect a cautious approach towards Chinese investments and influence, highlighting concerns over national security and sovereignty. And the United Kingdom, too, continues to grapple with redefining its foreign policy post-Brexit, particularly in relation to China's growing global presence. So from wherever people are joining us for this seminar, I think there is immediate relevance and urgency to the issues that David will be sharing with us for the next hour and a half or so. So please do join with me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Professor David M. McCourt.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, let me share this and we can get going. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the chance to share my research with you. And that's kind of what I'm going to be doing mostly, taking you through an argument that I'm developing in, as Chris said, a follow-on study to The End of Engagement called, well, the title is up in the air, but the general gist is to track a set of shifts in the United States, Australia, and London, and the United Kingdom on China policy over the last 7 or 8 years or so. I would like to add that what I shared with you in terms of writing was a little bit more sketchy than I would have liked. I've got some nice reviews of the manuscript, but actually the introduction is where a lot of the work needs to happen. And so for those of you who waded through it, a little bit of an apology that it perhaps doesn't do everything that it could do for a seminar like this. But let's get stuck in anyway. So what I'd like to do for you, with you, is to trace a shared shift in China policy between Washington, Canberra, and London, which I'm calling the road to AUKUS. Just sort of the broad outlines and the standard ways of understanding how we've gotten to where we are on China policy in the United States, Britain, and Australia over the last 7 or 8 years. And then I'll kind of broadly outline my argument, which is to try to understand these as a shared policy shift that is the effect of an alignment between Washington, Canberra, and London as spaces of knowledge production about China, which I call hegemonic field effects. Don't worry too much about that. I'm not going to go into theory too much, but to try to see that Washington, Canberra, and London are interrelated spaces of knowledge production, and that the proper object of analysis then is not 3 entirely separate places and spaces, but 3 connected spaces with particular types of individuals engaged in particular kinds of struggles over policy and framing of China as a particular kind of thing in world politics, and how on slightly different timelines the 3 spaces got to a particular understanding of China. And then what I'll try and do is just lay out some questions for discussion on this broader question of the relationship between the common good, the social contract, whatever we want to call it, and large geopolitical questions of extreme significance, as Chris kind of mentioned. Okay, so let's dive right into AUKUS. Now, what I'm using AUKUS, which, as you know, is a submarine and defense deal between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. I'm using this as an example, really, an artifact of a broader shift on China that has taken place since 2017. So it's not really a book just about AUKUS. AUKUS is just the best example, as we see here. The AUKUS deal annoyed France because it relied on Canberra reneging on a deal with Paris to buy submarines for the Australian Navy. Obviously, it is targeted fairly directly at China. So we see the annoyed China in the background, Japan and Taiwan sort of giggling away, saying this is great. The Three Musketeers of London, London, Washington, and Canberra then. We also see with the AUKUS deal some of the cracks in the Australia United States, United Kingdom convergence, in that whether the AUKUS deal ever comes to much is still up in the air. This is an extremely expensive deal, at least the submarine parts of it, perhaps up to 368 billion Australian dollars. Some people like to call them Schrodinger's submarines because they may never actually appear. But the AUKUS deal sort of typifies this convergence between Washington, Canberra, and London that I'm trying to put on the table. Now, one of the problems when you're thinking about large-scale geopolitical events and trends and tendencies is that they're often what we might call overdetermined in terms of why they're coming about. And why we might think about something like the spaces of knowledge production, which I'm going to sort of suggest is the proper place of analysis, is often kind of pushed to one side in favor of the more immediate causes that we see in the newspapers and in the news that we hear, which are some version of China's changed, now policy toward China has been a failure, important individuals, systemic change, and public opinion change, which I can just kind of briefly lay out for you. So if you ask the person on the street, why exactly has Australian or British or American policy towards China changed since 2017, they'll repeat what they get from the news, which is that China has changed. And China has changed, and this is one of the problems with my analysis, is that I don't want to play down very real changes in how China governs itself domestically and is engaged in the world over the last 10 to 13 years since the coming to power of Xi Jinping. There's lots and lots of examples of serious problems that China poses to Western policymakers. To those of you who know something about this debate in Australia, I've chosen this picture from a book by Clive Hamilton about Chinese interference in Australian domestic politics and society, which really sort of typifies the fear that has emerged over the last 7 or 8 years about China. Now, that has manifestations in Washington and London. In Washington, it's particularly a concern over a geopolitical challenge from Beijing, the militarization of the South China Seas, and threatening Taiwan in particular, and also crackdowns on democracy in Hong Kong. In Britain too, the Hong Kong issue is a major one. So in terms of common explanations, China has changed is very, very prominent, and China has changed. So any attempt to kind of argue against that is immediately weakened by the fact that it needs to address the issue that China has changed in lots of ways, and many of which are negative. In the United States, particularly, the argument is common that America's policy toward China failed. This is the argument that something called engagement, which I trace in the other book that Chris mentioned, was a failure. This is the case that was put forward, particularly under the first Trump administration, and I'll talk about in a second. That engagement was this attempt to bring Beijing into the international system since 1972, especially since the late 1970s and the normalization of diplomatic relations, and it was ultimately a failure. It was predicated on optimistic post-1989 ideas of liberal democracy's ultimate victory, and we need to get real on China. China's not changing. Our ability to change China is limited. In terms of individuals, then we see in the Australia case someone key like Malcolm Turnbull, who began his time as Prime Minister as an important supporter of good relations with Beijing before really changing his tune, in part because of intelligence about Chinese domestic interference in Australia. And he became a key figure in terms of the shift, which the seminar is actually named after, the idea of standing up to Beijing. Donald Trump is an important individual on that, and I'll name some others. For those of you who are aware of international relations theory, there is a sort of a broader school of thought. So here we see the Chinese flag and the American flag are placed on top of images evoking what they call the Thucydides' trap. Thucydides' trap. Thucydides, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War, who traced the rise of Athens and the fear it elicited in Sparta. And so here we have the sort of the reverse, the United States fearful of a rising China. And that kind of imagery is quite common. But hopefully you can see that for numerous reasons, a China changed argument, an individual's argument, and a systemic change argument are not enough to really help us to understand why, on different but coordinated timelines, leaders and elites in Washington, Canberra, and London all changed their tune on China. These explanations are all involved. This is social science, not natural science. Our explanations aren't easily separated from one another. But they're also not adequate. And neither adequate is the argument that public perception of China and public opinion drove foreign policy makers to change their policies toward China. So here we see, helpfully, the Lowy Institute in Sydney collects public opinion polls every year on Australians' views of China. And what we see here is that Australians' perceptions start to dip in late 2018 and going into 2020, only becoming more pessimistic than optimistic, if you like, where the darker line crosses the lighter line here in early 2020. Now, what this shows us is that, yes, Australian public opinion and public perceptions of China has gone in a more negative direction, but it's not enough to explain a shift in Australian elite and government position, which actually took place earlier in 2017 and 2018. So Malcolm Turnbull was making the standing up to Beijing speech in 2017. The banning of Huawei and the concern over Chinese investment in telecommunications in Australia occurred earlier than this. So I'm not digging this argument out as in an extended way as I would like to, but the point is simply that common explanations of why Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom have changed their tune on China need augmenting at the very least, and perhaps a new framework for understanding, which is the kind of framework I'm wanting to put out there. Okay, so my apologies for far too much text on this slide and a few others. This talk came at a busy time, but so I hope you'll forgive me, but there'll be plenty of images. But let me just put my vision out there for you, which is to try to see Washington, Canberra, and London as interconnected spaces. They're not separate, confined policy-making spaces only looking at China in an isolated way. drawing on the sociological theory of Pierre Bourdieu, which again, I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, but I don't think it's going to help us very much to get into the ins and outs of Pierre Bourdieu's thoughts. Enough to say that in Australia, Britain, and the United States, we can think of there existing social fields at play, which we can call the China fields, where people involved are trying to become knowledgeable and influential on the topic of China. Now, what this does for us is it helps us to realize that the ability to speak the truth about China is a really strange thing if you think about it. Because all experts on China know something, but they don't know everything. In a sense, there is no China that can be ultimately known. That's an argument that maybe a Foucauldian discourse analysis would tell you the same kind of thing. That sociology of knowledge of various types would tell you. So if we start to understand Washington, Canberra, and London, then not in terms of just isolated policy spaces, but as fields that are populated by a certain number. And in Washington, in Canberra and London, we're talking about just a couple of dozen people whose job it is to try to speak authoritatively about China. In Washington, it's much larger, but these are what I call in the book and in the end of engagement, the China Watchers. And what I'm tracing and what I think can help best explain an alignment on China policy, a tougher China policy, is how the same kinds of China watchers popped up in positions of authority and power in Washington, Canberra, and London from 2017 onwards, who had a very different view of China than an earlier group, which were more interested and convinced about what we call engagement or cooperative optimistic policies towards China. So in terms of how we understand this, then we can do two things at the same time. We can show that American power and American hegemony, which is legitimate domination of international affairs, is both central but not determinative of how Australia and the UK have made policy towards China over the last 8 or 9 years. This perhaps isn't an argument that will interest you if you're not a scholar of international politics, but it is a sort of a driving force. So that Washington has made Canberra and London toe the line on relations with Beijing, but not entirely. And as we'll see, Australia in particular has had a very strongly independent view of relations with Beijing and has been an important driver of policy in Washington in certain respects. London is has a partial alignment on China for various reasons, which I'll go into. So we see this alignment on a tougher China policy by tracing similar kinds of language, a competitive view, notions like a rules-based international order, similar frames of China as a systematic rival. We see similar kinds of people and particular dominant voices emerge in the three cases. And so what I'll do briefly in each case is to trace in the United States case what we call a paradigmatic turnover from engagement to strategic competition. In Australia, a policy shift from the golden era of relations between Canberra and Beijing to standing up, which was declared by Turnbull. And in the UK, a partial policy shift to what is an unclear policy, definitely grappling with the challenges of relations with Beijing, but not a clear policy like strategic competition or standing up to Beijing. Okay. I won't talk about methods because it's not a job talk. It's much more of an informal thing, just to say that I spoke to everyone that would speak to me, basically. And in the Australia case, that was mostly done by Zoom, which meant that I was getting up at all times of night to try to talk to people at midnight from California to Melbourne, say. There was one with a fairly prominent person who I missed by a full 24 hours because of the time difference. But I spoke to as many people as I could, went to Washington, D.C. and London as much as I possibly could. And I think that there's enough there to be able to speak authoritatively about Washington, Canberra, and London. Okay, so let's dive in to these three interconnected spaces of knowledge production, by which I mean what one interviewer called a permanent conference on China in Washington. In Canberra, less so, but increasingly over the years, there is this feeling that it is an ongoing conversation, and I'll talk about London in a second. So Washington, D.C. is the global epicenter of China watching. One interviewer called it a permanent conference on China. Someone else said, which was actually an Australian, you can swing a cat at the corner of 18th and K Street, which is where all the lobbyists, and you're bound to hit someone who claims to be a China expert or who really is one. Now, typically when we're talking about foreign policy, particularly in the discipline of international relations, the foreign policy experts are kind of pushed to one side. We don't tend to do a kind of a sociology of how they make objects known, partially because their influence is fleeting and it's very hard to trace. It's not the case that someone from, say, the Council on Foreign Relations has gone into a government and by themselves changed policy. So it's easier to just focus on Trump does this and Trump says that, or the United States has done this, and you'll sort of sense that from your reading of the newspapers. It's much more difficult to talk about at the level that I'm trying to talk about, which is what we might call the meso level, not the micro of individuals like Trump or the macro of great power politics, but how the cut and thrust of debates and what I'm going to call paradigmatic turnover. But these maps, they're not analytical. They're just to try to help you see, to take your mind to Washington. Now, what I do in the other book that Chris mentioned, which is the jumping off point, is to show that between 2017 and 2023, the United States underwent a paradigm turnover. I used paradigm turnover in the sense of Thomas Kuhn, the sociologist of science, I guess he is, or historian of science, showed how paradigmatic turnovers happen in science, in the hard sciences. And something similar happened with how the United States China watchers talk about and think about China over the course of 2017, which was particularly the Trump administration brought in a whole new group of experts going to think tanks and research organizations that typically presidents hadn't gone to get their expertise on China. Okay, so what I do is, and I'm kind of having to go through this a little bit more briefly than I probably should, is to break down this notion of engagement. The notion of engagement, again, was the broad idea that the United States could bring China into the international system and reap the benefits, that all boats will rise with international involvement, and perhaps we might even see liberalization and dare we say it, democratization in China. This was the operative paradigm. Now, paradigm we can see then as having attributes of frame, policy, and community. What I'm trying to do here is to push back against, again, another idea, which is that engagement is a simple thing. It is, as a paradigm, it's a social thing and therefore has all sorts of contradictions. Many people don't think it ever existed. And so talking to engagers and people in Washington, you have to be very careful about what you're actually talking about. So we can split engagement in terms of a frame, a policy, and a community. In terms of a frame, the clearest declaration was actually in a sort of Owl of Minerva type example. In May 2020, the Trump administration narrated the history of US-China relations. in the attempt of to put forward a new paradigm called strategic competition. But in so doing, they constructed its other, if you like, engagement. And they said that since the United States and PRC established relations in 1979, the US policy was largely premised on a hope that deepening engagement would stir fundamental opening in the PRC. More than 40 years later, I'm just skipping, as you can see, it's become evident that this approach has failed. Now, what this document and other speeches by Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, and others did was to really, in some ways, again, after the fact, create this thing, this frame called engagement. Engagement was a failure. This is highly specific to the United States case. We don't see this kind of language in in Canberra or London. And it speaks to how Washington works as a space of knowledge production. The administration of Trump had to not only be correct on a new China policy, it had to delegitimize all of those experts that had believed that the US and China could actually get on. And that kind of belief is engagement as a set of policy manifestations, which loads of different kinds of policies could be lumped under, from World Trade Organization membership to the many strategic and economic dialogues that today seem a lifetime ago. So engagement then was a frame, it was also a policy, but also importantly, it was a set of people who believed that engagement worked, and replaced under Trump by people who didn't believe engagement was possible, and in fact believed engagement was a failure. Now, since this is being recorded, but also when I've spoken off the record, I always feel uncomfortable about putting people's faces on slides, because nothing about what I'm trying to say here is what we might call the logic of the trial. I'm not suggesting that anyone in particular is right or in particular is wrong. I've spoken to many of these people, and the faces I'll show you for Canberra and London, and I like them, and I think that they're trying their best for their countries and the national interest. So that sort of maybe shapes our discussion later. So just, yeah, none of this is the good guys and the bad guys. It's also not a simple story of the hawks and the doves, which is something that often foreign policy commentary breaks down to. But the engagers were a group of experts, think tankers, sometimes people who went in and out of government, academics, business consultants, journalists, who believe that the United States is best served by engaging China. And many of them still believe that. The strategic competitors are a group that believe that engagement is always on China's terms, and therefore a framing of competition is a much better basis for policy making. Now, again, this is something that's culturally specific to the United States. I want to try and stress. It's related to the system of what they call in and out, or the open door, revolving door into Washington, which you may have heard of. In Washington, it's full of think tanks because people are waiting for the next government, the next president to be elected, so that they can go into the next administration to offer policy. This isn't the case in Canberra, and it's not the case in London, except to a very small degree. I think Penny Wong's speechwriter at the moment is an ex-academic, for example, but it's very, very rare. So that's an important kind of point, which is to speak about cultural specificities. So Matthew Pottinger in the top right here was a really important figure. He came in to the Trump White House at the National Security Council, and not single-handedly, but with a bunch of sort of like-minded individuals, set about reframing US-China relations. And really the story, in another way of putting it, and this is why these kind of seminars are really useful, because I haven't really thought about this before. It's a story of policy diffusion. Right, it's a story of how the strategic competition became the way of seeing China in London and Canberra as well, in part informed by the Canberra experience particularly, but also one that brings about similar kinds of people speaking similar kinds of language, seeing China in a similar kind of way, and therefore being more successful in their own domestic field because of those resources that they get from Washington, if that makes sense. Okay. So, Chris, I'm assuming that most people in the seminar are kind of Australian or coming from Australia. Is that correct?
But we do have an international audience. I think it would be fair to say that a sizable portion of the people in the seminar are from Australia, but I wouldn't assume that everybody here is Australian.
Okay, right. Well, good, because I have some material on Canberra, but it's not predominant, and so I'll kind of continue to talk a little bit about London too. But let's switch to Canberra again, understood as a separate but not entirely disconnected space of knowledge production about Washington, about Beijing, about China to the United States. So I'm trying to sort of like not fall between two stools here, which is the Canberra's separate from Washington. Of course it is. It's a long way away, but it's not entirely separate. For example, ASPI, which is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, had, or perhaps still has, a Washington office. So what I'm trying to do is show that although how Canberra works is going to be very much driven by Australian dynamics, it also has to be understood as tied to Washington in particular, and London to a slightly lesser extent. So as they call it the Washminster hybrid. I go in the book into trying to think a little bit about how Canberra works. In the bottom corner, we see a similar small map of Sydney, because obviously Canberra is a sort of a catch-all term to understand how Australia makes policy and how Australia makes knowledge of China. But this is very much a story about the Canberra bubble, about how Canberra sees China and how it's been influenced then by this shift in Washington from engagement to strategic competition. The first point, interconnected with Washington across numerous organizations and people. And so we need to see Americans constantly in Canberra, at fellowships at the major organizations, government-to-government exchanges, interparliamentary exchanges, including a really important body called the Interparliamentary Alliance, through which this competitive view of China has diffused very strongly. Okay. So again, trying to do this thing which is kind of tough, which is to see China, the Canberra debate, as specific to Australia, but also deeply tied to London and Washington. And what we've seen over the last 8 years is a very, very intense debate and an increasing field alignment, if not total, with Washington on China. So the intensity of the China debate is important because it's a similar level of intensity that you get in Washington, but I would say for different reasons. It's not that the debate in Canberra and in Australia, in the Australian public, is as intense because think tankers want to go into the Australian government. It's because China itself is a very, very important issue in Australia for a number of reasons. One of which is this sense that Australia is the canary in the coal mine of China's rise. But one of the quotes that I like the best is that an Australia-China expert told me is, the issue in China about China in Australia is not about China, it's about Australia. So let me just kind of rephrase that. The issue in Australia is that it's not about China, it's about Australia. Whereas in the United States, China's rise threatens American power and geopolitical influence. What China threatens in Australia is Australia's national identity as a multicultural democracy in Asia, a white white-dominated multicultural democracy in Asia. And so this is a different kind of debate. Nonetheless, it's adopted similar kinds of dynamics to Washington. And let's dive into the people first as a way and I'll go back to that slide. So in the place of the engagers versus the strategic competitors, in Australia, you've seen the strengthening of a group that China experts themselves label the securocrats. Now, the securocrats are not all members of the security services. They are people who are either journalists, consultants, members of the security services actually inside the government, or at places like ASPI. So here on the left, top left, we see John Garneau, who was Australia's ambassador to China, Ross Garneau's son, a journalist stationed in China, and he wrote a very influential report for Malcolm Turnbull that really painted Chinese influence in Australia in very dark tones, and he was very, very influential with the shift to a standing up to Beijing policy. Bill Birtles, alongside him, a journalist kicked out of Beijing in, I think, 2020 or so, 2020, 2021. Again, a very strident critic of Beijing. Beneath him is Andrew Shearer, member of the security services, and to his left is Michael Shoebridge from ASPI. So he is the strong group of sharp critics of Beijing. Now, on the right, then, are a group misnamed, really, the economists, because many of them are not economists. They are diplomats, academics, some academic economists, former policymakers and diplomats, many of whom were associated with the golden era of Australia-Chinese relations, and going back into previous eras, the Gough Whitlam times, and into the 1980s, when it seemed like Australia and China had strong complementarities on trade and politics, and it seemed like Australia and China really have everything to gain from good relations and nothing to lose from poor relations. So just to name these: James Lawrenson at the University of Technology, Sydney; Jeff Raby, top right, a former diplomat; John Menadue, I think a former diplomat, bottom right, and Jane Golly. There's loads of others I could put out there, and so these are just sort of to sort of give you a sense. And the idea then is, with the strong field alignment with Washington through numerous processes, the securocrat's voice becomes more powerful and prominent in the China debate in Canberra over the course of 2017, 18, 19. It got very nasty in 2020 on Twitter, including claims. Jane Golly really did get it very, very strongly, very critical. James Lawrenson is often very much criticized as being sort of far too strong, far too close to Beijing's view. Through a number of different processes. But the headline point is, through access in Washington, direct pressure and contact between the securocrats and the strategic competitors, a degree of bureaucratic convergence. So how Canberra makes policy towards Beijing starts to look quite similar to how Washington makes policy toward Beijing. Here we see a separation of trade and security portfolios. They begin to start speaking the same language, and therefore seeing the world in the same kind of way, such that something like AUKUS makes a lot of sense, even though on its face there's lots of arguments to say that AUKUS is not necessarily the most rational response to China's rise. Now, again, I'm trying to remain neutral here. I'm not saying necessarily that it's a bad idea. I'm just trying to lay out the lay of the land. Okay, so it's really not the case that Canberra just only follows Washington. Canberra actually got out in front, in some ways, in a little bit too much in front, according to some, where Turnbull and Scott Morrison really pushed for, I think it was Morrison that pushed for a COVID inquest, and that says COVID ban. It's meant to be Huawei ban. Australia really got in front of Washington, such that some interviewees who were actually securocrats said that they were a little bit concerned that Australia got too far in front. Okay. With the last few minutes, I want to kind of just say that this story of alignment follows in London too, a space deeply connected to Washington in particular, and also in some ways to Canberra. So here we see the major organizations that have a serious capacity on China expertise. Chatham House, obviously, But they're actually fairly few in number. And in some ways, one of the interesting things is that the number of China watchers and China experts in London is fairly similar to Canberra, even though the UK is a good 3 times as big, which says something about the specificities of the debate in Washington and Canberra. Again, America is massive, not simply because of the US geopolitical power, but I actually think that the reverse is true. I think the knowledge production comes first and reinforces the geopolitical hegemony, but that's a different topic. Okay, so what we see in Britain is a partial field alignment where we see China skeptics squaring off against what I call the navigators, who are people who are trying to say that the UK needs to try to navigate this tough relationship with Beijing, but cannot cut off relations entirely, and can't go down the decoupling route that many strident strategic competitors in Washington would like to go down, and perhaps some of your ASPI folks in Canberra. Much smaller ecosystem and a fairly lacking public debate really on China, and strong vestiges of what we call engagement speak. So James Cleverly, the former foreign minister, is up there speaking in very similar ways to presidents in the United States prior to 2016. So we can see here MPs, cultural relations folks like Andrew Caney, bottom right, he's a UK China National Committee on Relations. Kerry Brown on the right as well, who's a well-known academic, sometimes criticized as being far too sympathetic to Beijing. And on the left, we see people like Ian Duncan Smith, who's a strong critic of Beijing. Tom Tugendhat, the former Minister of Security, he is speaking a very, very similar language to Andrew Shearer and Matthew Pottinger. That's kind of the key take home. Why is it that across these three seemingly separate spaces, we see similar kinds of people saying similar kinds of things? The obvious argument is that China changed, and so they're speaking the truth. Well, China did change, but China is an extremely complicated object of knowledge if we think about it. And therefore, to think of Washington, Canberra, and London as interconnected spaces where people are trading, if you like, ideas, language, organizational styles, and discourses. Again, if we want to kind of like tip our hat to Foucault, that for me is the key story that we're seeing. Okay, so I think that I've probably twittered long enough. So let's just put some discussion questions on the table. I realize I've painted a very quick, broad brush picture of field alignment between three spaces, the hegemonic field of the United States and two subordinate fields of London and Canberra. But they raise really important questions for people in those spaces and others besides. What really are the trade-offs between the concern over China and the kind of security and military lens that gives rise to something like AUKUS? How can the common good or something like a social contract be squared with these overwhelming or seemingly overwhelming priorities that come along with geopolitical thinking and geopolitics? What role should country specialists and experts play in foreign policy formation? As people say, China policy is too important to be left to the China experts and generalists, business people. The ordinary citizen, we might say, what role do they have to play in the important questions put out there when it comes to standing up to Beijing? And I'll leave it there. Should I perhaps leave those up there, or I don't want to? Maybe I could stop sharing.
Thank you so much, David. I've taken the prerogative of stopping you sharing myself. Rather
Great.
Rather abusing my power there. But thank you very much indeed for opening up this fascinating and incredibly consequential series of thoughts for us. Can I just reiterate to everyone that if you do have a question you want to ask, if you could just write a little line in the chat, just very quickly, and then I'll know that you want to ask a question and I can call on you. I might just ask a question of my own, David, if I could, while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts and ask. And it follows on from, I think it was the first question you put up there at the end. And I'm currently researching the idea of the common good in the context of the social contract. And so those are the issues that are top of mind for me. And what I'm wondering is, to what extent can the common good, however we understand that term, be anything other than inversely proportional to competition? In other words, the more we see ourselves as in competition, the less we are working for the common good. Or is that quite a naive way of thinking about these relationships? Is there a sense in which the common good could sit quite happily with a more, and I know that you qualified this word in what you said, but with a more hawkish approach? Is it too simplistic to see the common good as tracking very closely with, the sort of more collaborative relations?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's precisely the question, right? And I guess where I try to think about is what resources we have for thinking about what the nature of the common good. And I guess my head goes to thinking about the national interest, which is a sort of the notion in international relations theory and political philosophy about sort of realism, realpolitik, and its relationship to the good of everyone. Now, so I start in the conclusion to the book, I kind of think, well, what is the role of the expert in speaking the national interest? Because in classical sort of thinking about the national interest, going back to sort of Morgenthau and Meinecke and others, there was this idea that they could speak the state's universal, the sort of the universal class interest that the state represented. I mean, you get into kind of classic political philosophy questions, but we all know that universal class interest as kind of put forward by the idea of the national interest doesn't exist. It's always specific interests of particular sort of fractions of capital, etc. So that is not a good answer at all. But it's at least sort of like that's the kind of the terrain that I think that's one form of terrain that opening up the question of the common good gets you to, because it's interesting that you start right there, because I start with with my conclusion to the book with a fascinating quote, like my favorite quote from all of my interviews, which was a trade practitioner in Washington in about 2018. And he was one of these folks that probably wouldn't be too far away from Peter Navarro and the folks that have actually persuaded Trump to put in tariffs. So he wouldn't be too far away from Trump's view. And we had this very pleasant lunch in a Washington brasserie. And I was trying to be on my best behavior and show my sort of Oxford background, because he was clearly an elite. And then he left me with a firm handshake and said, stay true to the common man. And because that's what he thinks he's doing. Like he thinks that tariffs would bring back jobs to North Carolina furniture makers. And it really, really struck me. And so what I do in the conclusion is kind of riff on that. Like, who is the common man? You know, like I'm the grandson of coal miners all the way back to 1700, right? I'm kind of thinking about this from a very sort of personal perspective. But that's not at all a good answer to your question, but I think it's an important starting point.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. As we're waiting for people to chip in, and do please chip in, raise your hand in Zoom, or put a little line in the chat if you would like to ask a question. I just wonder if I could have one follow-up, David. You mentioned in your reply just then this idea of elites again, and that this person in Washington presented themselves very much as a member of the elite. And in the talk, as I heard it, you were suggesting that a change in the attitude to Beijing of the elites political elites, sort of cultural elites, led down the track to a changing of public opinion. And two questions in relation to that. First of all, is that direction of flow general? Is it that the elites do effectively drive public opinion, and that we can predict what public opinion will be, say, 2 or 3 years down the line by the changes that are happening in elite circles now? And the second part of the question is, what do you think about, if to the extent that that is true, what do you think about that dynamic? Is that a, I suppose one way of framing it would be, is that a healthy dynamic to have? What does that tell us about the polity in those countries where public opinion can seemingly, if it is indeed the case, be so effectively led in that way? And what does that dynamic, how does that dynamic play into the questions that you're raising, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And where what I start thinking about when you say that is the case of housing prices in Australia. Because housing prices is very high. Lots of interviewees told me about the way in which in 2017, 2016, that was directly related to the China issue, because the system being that you can see who you're bidding against in a house, in a scenario where you're buying a house, and you can see if that person is Caucasian or not. And even people who would not think of themselves as having ethnic sort of biases would be triggered by that. So immediately you get into very sensitive issues of racism, ethnic discrimination, fear of takeover of wealth from coming in from other places. And then there was a sense in 2016 then that public opinion was really turning against China for a bunch of different reasons, tied to domestic interference, but also really housing prices being one kind of crux of it. And so then what happened was I was talking to sort of policymakers and academics and sort of critics at that time. And they would then later sort of say, well, the public had moved on the China issue. When, if you actually look at the Lowy poll, really, I think it's the other way around. And I think I've got to agree with you, Chris, that I think the general direction of flow always goes from the elites to the public through the media. I mean, I don't think you need to be like a crazy conspiracy theorist to see that the media drives the media drives frames and drives issues and prioritizes certain issues. I just don't think that you have to. I don't think as academics we can be naive. Like we're not looking at world politics as it is. We have to make sure that we look at it through as it's sort of filtered through the media. So I think that dynamic is general. I think it's worse in some places and at certain times. I think that certain highly influential individuals in US, UK, and Australian media sources, without naming names, we all know who they are, shape that dynamic strongly. And so I think that the case of house prices in in Australia is a really good example of how something that is a clear public issue. The question is how you talk about that in a way that's sensitive to the fact that it can very quickly trip um, uh, sensitive public issues to do with racism and ethnic discrimination, but still has to be talked about and can't be just put under the carpet. I mean, we're seeing it with the general election the last couple of days, right? The issue is front and center. It might be a bit separated from China issue, but in 2016 it wasn't. Okay, again, I've sort of twittered around your question rather than answered it directly. But hopefully that sort of gives us some resources.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It certainly does. Thank you. I've had a question from Ben, who
Right. Yeah,
given
I'm actually just I just sent him a quick direct message because Ben and I are old friends. So
that's wonderful.
yeah, I was like,
just to explain for people who haven't got the chat in front of them, Ben has a sleeping toddler in the next room, and so has requested that I read out the question, so as not to sort of cause chaos in the domestic situation. So I will read out Ben's question here. Characteristically terrific talk, Dave. It begins.
Thank
I
you,
was
Ben.
wondering whether any of those you spoke with had much of a sense of the importance of their own links to China watchers in the other two capitals. Brackets, did they see themselves as a kind of field in any sense, even without using this language? Or even within each country, did they self-identify as a group or camp of China watchers at all?
Yeah. So yeah, I did obviously kind of try and get into that. And one of the benefits of sort of thinking in terms of field theory is that you really try not to impose the boundaries of the field. You let it sort of come to you. And so one of the things I would ask is, to what extent is there a field? Are you part of it? What are its boundaries? Who's in, who's out? And in the book, there's going to be lots of that kind of thing. And so there was definitely a sense from um, China experts across each of the countries that they think of themselves as part of a field that's transnational, um, as in people in London specifically kind of said, we're not, well, we take part in the US debate as well as kind of taking part in the UK debate. Although in the UK they're very kind of conscious of the fact that it's a small community, but they do all sort of hang out with each other. I mean, it raises all sorts of really interesting questions, Ben, because one of the issues is you see is that in Britain, for example, one of the hindrances to a really strong community is London house prices. To go back to that, people can't live there. So if you're an academic, I know one of the best, I think lives in London and sorry, works in London and lives in like Durham. It's a long way away because you can afford to live there. That's not the case in Washington. Washington people get paid more. They can all be there, and so that's why they're all really aware that they're part of the China watching gang. It's a very strong club. I mean, this is a tribe. Like if this is kind of political anthropology, if you like, these are three sub tribes of a broader global tribe, but it's very much centered on the United States. So I think the United States China watchers will recognize someone from, say, ANU or Chatham House, but also really can kind of ignore them at will. I mean, we all know this from the academic game, right, Ben? The Americans will at APSA or listen to us or at ISA, the big international relations conference, and they'll listen to us when they want to, and when they want to just close and have their own debate, they'll kind of close and have their own debate. So it's a little bit like that. Interestingly, I didn't get to say it really in Canberra. Canberra's not, or Australia's not such a specialized China conversation as what some people call the China shouting match, which I think ties to Australian cultural specificities. You all have to push back at me, but like, a good Anglo-Irish, you like a good scrap and a good fight. And so it wasn't quite the same as in Washington. It's still a little bit more policing the boundaries based on who speaks what level of Chinese, time spent in country. Because China is such a big issue in Australia generally, you still get a kind of a club field, if you like, but it's looser, a lot more IR generalists, a lot more journalists who maybe speak Chinese but maybe don't. So Ben, I'm thinking about someone like Ian Hall here, right? Ian's a very good IR scholar, I think, at Griffith. And one of the sort of most important voices in the academic side in Australia, but in Washington, he wouldn't really look like a China expert because I don't think he speaks Chinese. He's really an India expert who has kind of crossed over a little bit. So I could talk your ear off, everyone, about the three spaces and what drives them, but certainly they think of themselves as part of a transnational field with national specificities.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Pleasure. Thank
On
you.
behalf of Ben, who is unable to speak, thank you as well. I think both Alan and Stephanie have a question. We'll go to Alan first, if we could.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks, David. That was a great talk.
Thanks, Alan.
I was just thinking. China's always had a vast army, and after all, we fought them in Korea. but they used to have a really small navy and small air force, and yet they've been growing exponentially, and that's expected to keep just to keep growing. Whereas the Americans have almost topped out. That's sort of the impression I get, or they're getting very near. And I just sort of, if the military balance of power is really going to keep changing quite significantly, I wonder how that fits into theoretical frameworks.
Yeah. Yeah, really good question, actually, because one of the things I didn't really sort of have time to talk about is that one of the subgroups uh, oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah,
We can hear
okay.
you.
I'm sorry, I think I got muted by accident. One of the subgroups of the economists are a group of people who are sort of acolytes of Hugh White. I don't know if you know the name Hugh White. Hugh White, okay. So Hugh White's the kind of the main voice in the China debate. Sam Roggeveen is sort of another person who says similar things, who basically argue that that the economists' view is the more correct one, because that Australia can't rely on the Washington security umbrella forever. And they are opposed by people like Michael Shoebridge and others at ASPI, who think that really the United States is the only way to go, because to the extent that Australia needs military hardware, that's going to come from somewhere, and that's going to come from the United States. And so that really is one particular kind of sub axis of opposition between the economists and the securocrats. And so you see the economists aren't really just chatting about economics. So what that shows is, or one of the things that kind of shows is that, again, this is about not just Australia and China, but Australia's position in the world more broadly. This fear of abandonment, first abandoned by Britain after 1941, and now perhaps abandoned by the United States, that Hugh White thinks that at some point America's leadership will realize that it can't defend Australia forever, simply because of the balance of power in naval and ballistic missiles when it comes to China. Now here the extent or the issue of distance crops up, because for people like Hugh White and Sam Roggeveen, Australia is still a heck of a long way from China. And although they will have a large navy, there's the stopping power of or the stopping power of water, or the distance issue is still one that they're going to have to try and overcome, even if you did get to a situation like Japan and Darwin in the Second World War. So yes, I've sort of, again, I've spoken around the issue, but the concern over Chinese military buildup is definitely a strong axis of opposition between ASPI-related securocrats and Hugh White-affiliated economists.
Thank you so much, David.
Yeah.
Alan, do you have a follow-up?
I was just going to say I did once meet Hugh White, because I failed a job interview with him about 20 years ago, and I still haven't forgotten. But we've all done that, I'm sure.
Excellent.
Okay,
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Stephanie, could I invite you to ask your question now, please?
Hi, thank you so much for that really interesting talk. I learned a lot, so I hope that my question isn't too uninformed. But
Not at all.
I'm speaking from Canada, so it's very relevant to here as well.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, sort of vaguely, what I'm interested in about the way that social relationships between individuals or political actors or states can evolve in order to pursue the joint common good. And just sort of vaguely, I was wondering about your views about the future. And I know that's quite vague, but in terms of the idea of how relationships can be reconstructed if there's sort of a digression of parties in pursuing a joint common good, and about how relationships can be either repaired when there is that divergence, or reconstructed based on new rules of engagement, sort of, and just how that might affect what your views are in terms of the future of these sorts of relationships. I know that's really vague, so I'm sorry if it's
No, but it's funny. Like it's hard to. I see exactly what you're trying to kind of put your finger on, really, and in some ways, precisely because it's hard to elaborate is because it's hard to think, right? So I don't like I that's a yeah. I totally get what you're trying to say. And let me just sort of so where my sort of thoughts went when you were talking was first to sort of say that I could have done this for Canada, right? There's a strong Canadian story here. The taking hostage of the two Michaels a few years. I don't know if you heard the two Canadian, and this was a response to it was related to Huawei, and it was a way to kind of get at the United States via the back door. Canada's had its own standing up to Beijing over the last few years. It's kind of gone off the headlines with US Canada tensions, interestingly, but Canada's is definitely in this transnational space. Canadian members of parliament are strongly represented in the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which is very much like in terms of the internationalization of a competitive, critical view of China is a really strong story. And I think what your question is trying to speak to is what are the possibilities of the internationalization of a of a kind of a more cooperative view in relation to China in some ways, because that speaks to the kind of the way in which strategic competition, let's just call it that, even though that really only applies to the US case, or say a critical view of China, can easily spread internationally. Like, as in, it's easy to create networks of critics and skeptics. But what about networks of what we might call engagers? In some way, engagement is a national project, and this goes back to what Chris started off the Q&A with, if you see what I mean. Like, engagement is about Canada's national interest, Canada's common good with America, with China. In the United States, engagement was about America's national interest in bringing China into the international system. So do you see where I'm trying to go with this? Like, the question is cooperative relations, if it's always only a national project, which I think that in a sense it has to be, because it's about the common good of Canadians as opposed to Americans, which I think is, again, my politics are coming out a little bit here, but I think that a degree of that is fine. How do you then internationalize that a little bit? And especially, how do you do that at the same time as you actually recognize the real challenges that relations with China poses? Because I think my presentation always sort of suggests a more positive view of China than I'm actually trying to put out there. I think relations with China, just like the keeping the two Michaels from Canada hostage a couple of years ago, that's a deeply problematic thing. Or the question of selling strategic assets to China, that's a deeply problematic thing. Just today, there is big debate in the United Kingdom about Britain's last steel works perhaps being sold to a Chinese company, because after this closure, we wouldn't have any, or Britain wouldn't have any ability to make steel. So I think that your question is absolutely right. Engagement as a view in America was basically like how it worked was through lots and lots of exchanges, university level exchanges, cultural exchanges, economic openness, economic and security dialogues, etc. Those were the kind of like those were the vehicles, but again, they were very domestic in nature. I'm trying to think of like their international components. I mean, international organizations, we haven't really spoken much about the UN and others. That would perhaps be somewhere we would have to kind of talk about. And that is actually part of this broader story, the decline of internationalism, the US turning its back on the United Nations, and the creation of things like AUKUS they're not international. They are, they're basically trinational, if you like. They're not like the United Nations, not even really like NATO. Okay, so yes, I think we kind of put some issues on the table there, if not really kind of flesh them out thoroughly. But yeah, it's a good question.
Right. Stephanie,
Thank you so much.
do you have a follow-up, or are you good?
No, I think that was really helpful in actually helping to clarify what I was probing at there with my thoughts and questions. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I wonder, as we begin to come gracefully into land at the end of this question time, if David, I might presume upon my chair's prerogative to ask one more question, if I
Sure.
can.
Yeah,
And it's sort of changing the level of focus. So it's been a session today very much about international relations, and for obvious and very good reasons. But there's also perhaps a domestic angle to this, which is that we've been talking about framing the relationship with China predominantly through a security lens in certain quarters. And I want to invite you to reflect upon the sociological consequences of that. For example, what might this mean for richly multicultural societies like Australia, for example, that has a very significant, Chinese diaspora community? It do you, how do you see these different international moves playing out within either the US or Australia or the UK in terms of Chinese populations within those countries, for example?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is something that my research, I think, puts on the table very squarely, but doesn't address, because that's not something I'm necessarily trained in. But I've just been really concerned throughout that in some ways, geopolitical discussions and modes of policymaking can often be really used as ways of avoiding very difficult domestic questions. Again, like the question of how much Chinese money should Australia allow into the housing market, or a question of housing provision, I think, can be often hidden by a geopolitical discourse. And I guess that then the question becomes, how can you have those really uncomfortable conversations about how many, say, Chinese students should be in Australian universities? Is it possible? So maybe you could answer the question for me. If you see like the debate over the recent limits on Chinese students in Australian universities over the last, say, 12 months or so, versus how it was in 2020, where it became a very vicious kind of Twitter match. Has Australia become able over the last 5 years to have that conversation in a rational and saner way? Because ultimately that, I think, is what it's about. I mean, it's the same kind of issues that we're sort of seeing in the United States over free speech right now. Like, can you have conversations that are very difficult, but because they speak to issues of race and racism and ethnic belonging, etc., but also address really important public policy questions. Yeah.
Yes, I suspect the answer to that is it depends who one is having those conversations with.
Right.
Uh,
Right. I mean, I think it's about, on the individual level, it's about cultivating elites and publics that can, and I'm speaking to myself here really as much as anyone, be brave enough to put their view out there, to find allies, and to be wrong if they're wrong. Right. And really to be reflexive about who they ultimately are. Again, this is the debate in Australia is very much about who Australia is as a country. And that's quite similar, I think, Stephanie, to Canada, actually. The issue of Chinese Canadians, that really important kind of questions come up. Yeah.
I think you've given us a great deal to think about, David, and you've very richly engaged with the questions that we've been asking. just before we thank David this evening, I would like to remind everyone that there is the final seminar of the semester in 2 weeks' time, where Professor Douglas Guilfoyle from the University of New South Wales, who's a eminent legal scholar in that institution, will be talking to us about the common good in relation to the law of the sea, who owns the seas, and whose good is in play in relation to those. So if you'd like to register for that, do please go to the Social Contract Research Network website, where you can find details of Professor Guilfoyle's talk. Other than that, it simply remains for me, on behalf of all of us, to thank very deeply our speaker for today, David McCourt. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. Great. Yeah. Love to meet everyone.